But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going to delve a little deeper into the secret history of the world, and we're going to look at the Lost Lemuria. Tonight, we're going to be reading some works from the Theosophical Society. Some of their members here will be reading from a book titled The Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria by W. Scott Elliot, and this was written in 1904. And we're going to delve a little deeper into the past here. And we're going to talk about the things the secret schools teach about the ancient world. Things you have probably never heard before. Now, I think we have all heard of Atlantis in one shape or form through the years. And, of course, there are certain legends attached to that, and we do have some historical context for that, related back to Plato and some of the other Greek philosophers. Speaking on Atlantis, or this lost civilization of Atlantis. But prior to Atlantis, there was the southern continent of Lemuria. And this was a very different time in the history of humanity, at least according to the secret schools. Now, they claim to have records dating back, telling about these things. Where they got them, I don't know. They never accurately explain where the records came from. They'll claim some lineage back to Atlantis, of course, and perhaps they did preserve the records from that in some way, shape, or form and bring them forward through the secret schools through the years. But maybe they didn't. Maybe this is all made up out of whole cloth. I don't know. I don't claim to have the answers, but when you begin to understand some of these things that they teach, and you see what it is that people in positions of power in this world believe about our past, our ancient past, things begin to make a little more sense as to the current state of affairs in the world today. Now, keep in mind, you do have to always take this stuff with a grain of salt. There's really no way to prove nor disprove it. But, of course, what's claimed here does begin to make a little bit more sense to you when you see the shape the world is in now and understand what it is they believe in the secret schools, those people who shape agendas in our world, and why, perhaps, they do the things they do, the things that they believe, that they act upon, that affect all of us. So whether you believe any of it or not is immaterial. They believe it, and if they believe it, they act upon their belief, and their acting on their beliefs will affect us all, because we're talking these are some high-level players in our world. These are the ones who control agendas in this world, and I like to refer to them as the dark occultists who run things in this world, and most certainly it's always about the occult at the highest, most levels of control in this world. Always ties back to this kind of a thing. But like I said, regardless of your belief in it or your disbelief in it, that doesn't matter. people in positions of power in this world very much believe in these things, and the things they do to act upon them will affect all of us. So it is important that we understand their modus operandi. We understand why they do the things they do, how they do the things they do, and what exactly they believe, and why exactly they believe it. And of course, we have these lost secret records. Now, much of it is out there in the public domain nowadays, but in times past, not that long ago, if you go back 10, 15 years or so, prior to that, this stuff wasn't largely available publicly. You had to either belong to one of these occult fraternities or have access to a good Masonic library or Masonic publishing company to get a hold of this stuff. It wasn't out there readily available for the public. But now, due to the wonders of the internet, we have these things available to us today. And sadly, they're beginning to disappear into obscurity as the digital censorship ramps up in this era. So now more than ever, it's important to actually gather whatever information you can and save it. If it's digital information, if it's a digital file, save it on an external hard drive or some such thing where you can keep it and save it for the time when it is no longer able to be found through the internet search engines, and that time's coming very rapidly. And this way, this information will be preserved in that way. But even more important than that, I think it's imperative that we maintain physical analog books. It's a lot more difficult to make all of those disappear than it is to make a digital file disappear off of the internet. So we need to maintain books in the traditional sense, in actual physical hard copy of information. You see, I think that is the way. We need to be able to preserve for future generations these things that we've learned, and to keep a record thereof. Because like I said, censorship is ramping up and it's hitting hard. And digital censorship makes it far too easy for the powers that shouldn't be to make things disappear. And I've been beginning to see trends of this now. People are beginning to notice how search returns come back very skewed, and how the search returns don't bring to the surface the things that they used to. I've been noticing this over the course of the past couple of years. It's getting relatively difficult now to find many things that were previously available. And this is all part and parcel of the plan. You see, the instruction book 1984 was written by George Orwell, otherwise known as Eric Blair, who was an insider within the circles of power around the Royal Round Table groups and all of these types of areas. He understood what was coming, and he wrote in 1984 about things disappearing down the memory hole. That was Winston's job in 1984. He was a fact checker, of all things. Didn't call him that so much in the book, but you get the idea. That's what was inferred there. He was a fact checker. He worked for the Ministry of Truth, and anything that didn't coincide with what the party wanted disappeared down the memory hole. Now, that's immensely easier when everything is digitized and everything's digital. All you have to do is press a delete button, and it disappears forever, the record of it, off of the net. It's not so easy to get rid of physical books. Now, we've always had traditionally book burnings and that kind of thing. And this is a modern day book burning, but the thing is, they've been trying to shift people away from physical books and from actually reading books and going more towards digital screen-based reading. And this is all by design, of course. Now, don't get me wrong, I have quite a massive catalog of digital records that I keep. PDF files of very many books. I have thousands upon thousands of books in my massive archive here. But I do also maintain some important physical books, and it's only due to lack of space that I don't have more physical books, but I do intend to maintain that collection and increase that collection as time goes on, because I think it's that important. We need to maintain physical hard copy records of a lot of these things. But enough about that, and you'll see how censorship has everything to do with what we're talking about tonight, because always this notion of hidden knowledge has been the key to control and power in this world. Secrecy is the oldest mind control tool ever created. If you know something that somebody else doesn't, that gives you a type of power over them in one way, shape, or form. This is the big secret. So they've maintained secret records, and this is admitted in their writings. They maintained secret records, I think we all know that, within these occult fraternities and these secret society groups, and a lot of the religious institutions like the Vatican. The Vatican has a massive library of documents and artifacts and various other things that the public has no idea about. They maintain these secret records of things past. And what the claim is here. Now, this comes from the Theosophical Society. As I said, this comes from Theosophists, those who believe in the writings of Madame Blavatsky and all of the others who contributed thereof. This information they claim to have had passed down to them through various channels, and I think by and large, a lot of it came from the Hermetic Brotherhood and the Rosicrucians. These secret society groups are all intertwined at the highest, most levels, by the way, folks. They're all intertwined. It's the inner circle within the inner circle. And this is what we would, in modern times, refer to as the Illuminati. And that's an even older name as well. And sometimes they go by other names. They don't always use the same name, but make no mistake about it, there is a small central group, an inner circle, that permeates all these other secret society groups and occult fraternities, and they are interlaced and interlocked at the topmost levels, and it's the same few players who have a lot of power and a lot of persuasion and a lot of influence within these secret societies. And from the secret societies, they've actually put in place their members throughout all of society, different levels of society, in different corporate type structures, in different governmental bodies, policy think tank groups, and the nonprofit groups, of course. All of these philanthropic organizations that somehow are the ones that always seem to manage to make policy and make that policy become law. Places like the World Economic Forum, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, all of the rest, the Rhodes Roundtable Group. We know all of these different organizations. Trilateral Commission. I could go on ad nauseum. All these different semi-secret groups that have influence and sway in this world, that are not elected bodies, but yet they make decisions for all of us without our consent. They do so all the time, and they implement policies without our consent all the time. And it's these people within this group of people at the topmost levels are the ones with all of the sway and the power and the influence, and many of them have connections to the highest, most levels of these secret society groups from which they get their secret doctrine, and they refer to it as such. And that's what we're going to be talking about here tonight, folks, the secret doctrine in regards to the ancient past and the lost continent and civilization of Lemuria, the southern continent. The southern continent, ruled over by the Lemurian star. What is the Lemurian star, you might ask? I had a very articulate listener who noticed when I was doing a show on Atlantis and I had mentioned something about the Lemurian star. They noticed that was the name of the ship in the old Captain America movie, the Winter Soldier movie. And there's a whole lot more packed in the symbology there, but the Lemurian star was the name of the ship in the beginning portion of the film, where they had to go and rescue hostages, Captain America and his team. Well, this very articulate listener picked up on that and commented on that. You see, it didn't escape notice, and I'm glad it didn't escape notice. So what is the Lemurian star? Well, it's a symbol that represents a lot of different things, but primarily it represents the star Sirius, which is massively important to the Freemasons. And the claim actually is that Sirius will become the southern pole star in, get this, 66,000 years from now. Always these numbers that crop up around these things. But the lost continent of Lemuria, ruled over by the Lemurian star, the southern continent, that points out that it's the southern continent, by the way. There's this connotation attached to it, and we'll see as we get into the reading here from this book that talks directly about things that are revealed in the secret doctrine, and the book of Zion, also referenced heavily by the secret doctrine and other places. This ancient book, and we'll see, these are all very important writings to the Theosophists, and where these come from exactly, it's kind of sketchy. But, even though it's kind of sketchy, they firmly believe this, and perhaps some of the information is legitimate. That's what we need to keep in mind. I think there's an air of truth to some of what's said here. But I also think there's a lot of poison mixed in with it. So we do need to be cautious and use our discernment, and use it wisely here, in trying to sort out what's what with a lot of this information. Now this flies in the face of what our modern scientism would tell you about our ancient past. But it's been maintained through the secret schools even unto today, despite what our modern science tells you. Because that's another control system. See, they give you this lens of observation that's called scientific method, and they've abused that notion of things. They've abused scientific method. And now scientific method doesn't even apply to the modern things that they call science. It's largely based on a belief structure, much like a religion. And that's why I say science is the religion of this new age. Science is the new God. This is what they acknowledge and what they believe and what they want you to believe. They hand you this new God to worship, science. And if they say science tells us this, then you must believe it or you're a heretic. Even though many of them who push this notion of science on us believe otherwise. They know a little secret something about our past that we don't. And some of that ties back, as we had covered previous here, to the lost continent of Atlantis. And some of it ties back even further still. Like I said, a lot of this, I think, comes directly from the Rosicrucians and or the Hermetic Brotherhood into Theosophy. And some of the descriptions have changed slightly through the Theosophist viewpoint. But it's all the same things being described. It's the same secret doctrine that permeates all of it. And it's consistent across all the different secret society groups. But there's only so far back you can trace it. And that becomes problematic. Because they claim a lot of this happened in prehistoric times. Times before modern man kept records. So how did they get this information? This is the other thing. A lot of it is claimed to be channeled through occult investigation, or derived at through occult investigation, whatever they want to call that, whether it's clairvoyantly or some other type of capacity that these people claim to know this stuff, or are able to contact external spiritual beings to get this information, or get in touch with the Akashic record. All these terms they use to describe some of these things. But there's also a written tradition that's been passed down with this stuff. And I know the Hermetic Brotherhood claims to have kept long-standing written records, secret records of things So perhaps it does go back a good ways. Probably as far back as the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Maybe even before that time, and of course we lost many records there. But that's a subject for another time. Let's get directly into this, because this is some fascinating stuff we're going to be looking at tonight, because it's going to describe things you've probably never heard before. Unless, of course, you've read some of these records that they've maintained through the secret brotherhoods. But let's get to it. The Lost Lemuria, and here is a little bit of a foreword here that says, the object of this paper is not so much to bring forward new and startling information about the lost continent of Lemuria and its inhabitants, as to establish by the evidence obtainable from geology and from the study of the relative distribution of living and extinct animals and plants, as well as from the observed processes of physical evolution in the lower kingdoms, the facts stated in the Secret Doctrine and in other works with reference to these now submerged lands. And that's the end of the foreword. So they want to establish this is what they know, and this is what they think they've been able to confirm as of 1904 as to the geological history of this world, that they could confirm some of what is brought forward in the Secret Doctrine. So that's essentially what he's saying there. He's saying nothing here is startling or new to people who have access to these records, but now we have geological evidence pointing to possibly the validity of some of these secret records. And that's what this is more about. So it gives you the history as they see it through the Theosophical Society. And it offers some evidences to support or back up the claims made by the Secret Doctrine. The Lost Lemuria. It is generally recognized by science that what is now dry land on the surface of our globe was once the ocean floor, and that what is now the ocean floor was once dry land. Geologists have in some cases been able to specify the exact portions of the Earth's surface where these subsidences and upheavals have taken place, and although the lost continent of Atlantis has so far received scant recognition from the world of science, the general consensus of opinion has for long pointed to the existence at some prehistoric time of a vast southern continent to which the name of Lemuria has been assigned. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. I don't know if the consensus of opinion really denotes this. Of course, we have stories of ideas like Pangea, or the supercontinent that once existed in prehistoric times, and because of the shifting of the tectonic plates and all of this stuff, the continents all separated from this one giant landform and spread out, and the water filled in the gaps. So we do have, I guess, some scientific consensus of the changing of land formations and the covering of portions of the land by sea and portions of the sea jutting forth new land. And that's the claim here. They're saying geologically we know that this is held up by science. But let's read on here. So, evidence supplied by geology and by the relative distribution of living and extinct animals and plants. The history of the Earth's development shows us that the distribution of land and water on its surface is ever and continually changing. In consequence of geological changes of the Earth's crust, elevations and depressions of the ground take place everywhere, sometimes more strongly marked in one place, sometimes in another, even if they happen so slowly that in the course of centuries the seashore rises or sinks only a few inches, or even only a few lines. Still, they nevertheless effect great results in the course of long periods of time, and long, immeasurably long periods of time have not been wanting in the Earth's history during the course of many millions of years. Ever since organic life existed on the Earth, land and water have perpetually struggled for supremacy. Continents and islands have sunk into the sea, and new ones have arisen out of its bosom. Lakes and seas have been slowly raised and dried up, and new water basins have arisen by the sinking of the ground. Peninsulas have become islands by the narrow neck of land which connected them with the mainland sinking into the water. The islands of an archipelago have become the peaks of a continuous chain of mountains by the whole floor of their sea being considerably raised. Gonna pause for a moment here before we continue on. So now they're pointing out some obvious points here. What they're claiming is landforms change, lands rise and fall into the sea. And of course, this all requires millions and millions of years. So you see how this will align with modern day scientific thinking. I don't claim to know the age of the Earth, folks. But here's the problem. Nobody really truly knows the age of the Earth. They make guesses. And of course, the whole notion of Darwinian evolution depends on this notion of extremely long periods of time. It necessitates the existence of long periods of time for this to be true or accurate. And we don't have the evidence for that to support that. But they claim it takes millions and millions and millions of years to see these changes happen. How they know that, I don't know, because as far as I know, man has not been around for millions and millions of years. Of course, they will claim otherwise in these occult fraternities, as we will see here. But how they could possibly know this is beyond me. Like I said, whether it's through their records or through occult investigation, as they sometimes call it, or whatever forms of investigation that they use to find out these things, I don't know, but this is what's been popularly brought forward through all these secret society groups through the course of time about these various facets of things. So we see how they like to use the argument, especially here, in many of these works written around the turn of the century, the 1800s going into the 1900s. They like to use what was then the state-of-the-art modern science to reify their already existent beliefs. And that's what they're doing here. They're saying geologically we know that these changes take place, but they've taken millions and millions of years. And that's all based upon, well, a time scale that was put in place by a Scottish lawyer named Lyell, who came up with the notion of the geologic column and arbitrarily assigned values to different fossils and rocks at various levels and layers of Earth, depending on how far down you dig. And this geologic column does not physically exist anywhere on Earth, never has, never will. It's just an idea. And he arbitrarily defined or arbitrarily assigned values to different layers or strata of rock, saying this layer of rock is X million of years old, and this next layer down here is X million of years old, and we can identify the layer of rock, how old it is, by the fossils that we find there, and we can identify the fossils found there by the layer of rock that it's in. So he arbitrarily assigned values of numbers of millions of years old, that this is based solely on that, on just an idea he put down on paper. And this is what they call science in the modern era, and this is what they've based the age of the Earth and everything else on. And the foundation is faulty, and the whole foundation they've built it on is flawed. But anyway, they use it when it's useful for them to do so, to reify their already existent beliefs. So they believe that mankind went through these many different ages of change, and these were long periods of time. Of course, they had to stretch them out into millions of years now. Long, long periods of time between these different epochs, as they call them in the occult fraternities, these different epochs. And like I said, maybe there's a kernel of truth to some of this, or maybe there's not. I just find it interesting that they will adjust their timelines and their stories that they tell based upon what the most recent scientific data would tell them. And they did this a lot in the early 1900s to reify their already existent beliefs. And it's still maintained to this day in the secret schools. But of course, the surface science, or the public face of science, will not acknowledge these things. So there's a tradition here. So regardless of whether it's true or not, it's a tradition that they hold. And we do find some notions of truth inherent in some of it. I certainly think mankind is far older than we know. Far older than what's been accepted here. You see, even the Bible speaks of an antediluvian period, a time before the flood, which it doesn't really give us a specific timeline of how long man existed here before the flood. It does give us the age of some of the figures in the antediluvian times, how long they lived and which children they begat and this kind of thing, and many scholars have put together a timeline based upon what it says in the Bible, but the Bible itself does not make a claim that this was the only timeline or number of years that passed at that point. You see, even if you go back and you look at the stories in the book of Genesis, we have no idea how long Adam and Eve existed in the Garden of Eden before original sin took place. No idea. It doesn't make any mention of that. So even based upon the things that scholars and theologians have put together on the age of the earth, we can't be certain of. And it's the same thing with science. The numbers applied by our modern science to the age of the earth, we can't be certain of. I think the truth probably falls somewhere in the middle. But of course you have your old earth proponents and your young earth proponents. There are many who believe that the earth is only about 6,000 years old. Some of them believe it might be 9,000 years old. And there are plenty more who think that the earth is billions of years old, according to modern scientific thinking. I don't know. I don't claim to know. But what I can tell you now is what they teach in these secret society groups about this, and we're going to get there. Let's read on. Thus, the Mediterranean at one time was an inland sea, when in the place of the Straits of Gibraltar, an isthmus connected Africa with Spain. England, even during the more recent history of the earth, when man already existed, has repeatedly been connected with the European continent, and been repeatedly separated from it. Nay, even Europe and North America have been directly connected. The South Sea at one time formed a large Pacific continent, and the numerous little islands which now lie scattered in it were simply the highest peaks of the mountains covering that continent. The Indian Ocean formed a continent which extended from the Sunda Islands along the southern coast of Asia to the east coast of Africa. This large continent of former times, Sclater, an Englishman, has called Lemuria, from the monkey-like animals which inhabited it, and it is at the same time of great importance from being the probable cradle of the human race, which in all likelihood here first developed out of anthropoid apes. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Now you see how Darwinian evolution was nothing other than a reification of already existent beliefs of these secret society groups. And you see how they use Darwinian ideas to reify their ideas in this time period in which this book was written. And you'll know a little something more about what it truly is all about as we continue on here. You see, they've taken these notions of spiritual evolution, and they've applied them in a physical, material world sense in the modern era, and this is to further engraft the human mind into this paradigm of materiality, or the hyper-materialist paradigm, in which all things can be explained, all phenomena can be explained through some physical, material world cause and effect sequence. That's where they want your mind. That's how they intend to capture your spirit, your soul. They don't want you thinking in terms of the spiritual or other worlds. worlds of manifestation in which things in this world interrelate. They don't want you to think in those ways. They want you to think in strictly this physical paradigm. And that's what this was about, this crystallization, for lack of a better term. We'll use their own occult terms of these things. The crystallization of the idea of evolution into Darwinian evolution. This is what was achieved there. And of course, they say here, in their secret doctrine, this is from their secret doctrine, that man first developed, the human race likely first developed out of anthropoid apes. Anthropoid apes. Now remember, many of these teachings that came forward through the Theosophical Society and from these occult fraternities, they predate the notion of Darwinian evolution, and this is where much of the things that we've accepted as Darwinian evolution today have come from their secret doctrine, from their beliefs. Now, does that make it true? I don't think so. But they want it to be perceived as true, and perception is reality, so if you perceive it to be true, it is true in some sense, and that's exactly how they want it. You see, they use your own mind and your own experience of this reality, your thought forms, to shape the reality. So if you act upon the belief that man evolved from apes, then certainly that makes it true to a certain degree, doesn't it? At least that's how they see it. But let's continue on here. So it says, the important proof which Alfred Wallace has furnished by the help of chronological facts, or chorological facts, that the present Malayan archipelago consists in reality of two completely different divisions is particularly interesting. The western division, the Indo-Malayan archipelago, comprising the large islands of Borneo, Java, and Sumatra, was formerly connected by Malacca with the Asiatic continent, and probably also with the Lemurian continent just mentioned. The eastern division, on the other hand, the Austro-Malayan archipelago, comprising Celebes, the Moluccas, New Guinea, Solomon's Island, etc., was formerly directly connected with Australia. Both divisions were formerly two continents separated by a strait, but they have now, for the most part, sunk below the level of the sea. Wallace, solely on the ground of his accurate chorological observations, has been able in the most accurate manner to determine the position of this former strait, the south end of which passes between Bali and Lombok. Thus, ever since liquid water existed on the earth, the boundaries of water and land have eternally changed, and we may assert that the outlines of continents and islands have never remained for an hour, nay, even for a minute, exactly the same. For the waves eternally and perpetually break on the edge of the coast, and whatever the land in these places loses in extent, it gains in other places by the accumulation of mud, which condenses into solid stone and again rises above the level of the sea as new land. Nothing can be more erroneous than the idea of a firm and unchangeable outline of our continents, such as is impressed upon us in our early youth by defective lessons on geography, which are devoid of a geological basis. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So, they use the science when it reifies their ideas, and they throw out the science when it doesn't back up their claims. So we have this notion here that through the course of time, always, the landforms change. Oftentimes, the land itself will be engulfed by the sea and fall underwater, and then at other times, land will begin to emerge from the sea in these giant mud floods and form new lands. And you thought that was a modern contrivance, the mud flood, right? Certainly not. But let's continue on here. The name Lemuria, as above stated, was originally adopted by Mr. Sclater in recognition of the fact that it was probably on this continent that animals of the Lemuroid type were developed. This, writes A.R. Wallace, is undoubtedly a legitimate and highly probable supposition, and it is an example of the way in which a study of the geographical distribution of animals may enable us to reconstruct the geography of a bygone age. This continent represents what was probably a primary zoological region in some past geological epoch. But what that epoch was, and what were the limits of the region in question, we are quite unable to say. If we are to suppose that it comprised the whole area now inhabited by Lemuroid animals, we must make it extend from West Africa to Burma, South China, and Celebes, an area which it possibly did once occupy. We have already had occasion, he elsewhere writes, to refer to an ancient connection between this sub-region, the Ethiopian, and Madagascar, in order to explain the distribution of the Lemurian type, and some other curious affinities between the two countries. This view is supported by the geology of India, which shows us Ceylon and South India consisting mainly of granite and old metamorphic rocks, while the greater part of the peninsula of the Tertiary Formation, with a few isolated patches of secondary rocks. It is evident, therefore, that during much of the Tertiary period, Ceylon and South India were bounded on the north by a considerable extent of sea, and probably formed part of an extensive southern continent or great island. The very numerous and remarkable cases of affinity with Malaya require, however, some closer approximation with these islands, which probably occurred at a later period, when still later the Great Plains and the tablelands of Hindustan were formed, and a permanent land communication effected with the rich and highly developed Himalayo-Chinese fauna. A rapid immigration of new types took place, and many of the less specialized forms of mammalia and birds became extinct. Among reptiles and insects, the competition was less severe, or the older forms were too well adapted to local conditions to be expelled, so that it is among these groups alone that we find any considerable number of what are probably the remains of the ancient fauna of a now submerged southern continent. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Now, I know much of this sounds very boring and dry. We'll get to the good stuff here shortly. But what they're saying is what they've found is geologically they've found evidence, and zoologically they've found evidence of this great southern continent that once existed, and that the land forms and the water forms, the oceans, were different at one time. And they refer to this massive southern continent as Lemuria, because they observed some of the same animals in various portions of the islands and the areas in the South Sea, most notably in Madagascar, which is the home of lemurs. You may have heard of lemurs. Now, which came first, the lemur or Lemuria as a name? Hard to say. I might have to delve a little more deeply into the etymology of the terms. But this is claimed that this Sclater guy named the Lemurian continent after these monkey-like animals called lemurs, because he noticed there was this typology inherent in all of these different southern portions that were no longer connected, these landforms. But let's continue on here. So after stating that during the whole of the Tertiary and perhaps during much of the secondary periods, the great land masses of the earth were probably situated in the northern hemisphere, Wallace proceeds, in the southern hemisphere there appear to have been three considerable and very ancient land masses, varying in extent from time to time, but always keeping distinct from each other, and represented more or less completely by Australia, South Africa, and South America in our time. Into these flowed successive waves of life, as they each in turn became temporarily united with some part of the northern land. although apparently in vindication of some conclusions of which had been criticized by Dr. Hartlaub, Wallace subsequently denied the necessity of postulating the existence of such a continent. His general recognition of the facts of subsidences and upheavals of great portions of the Earth's surface, as well as the inferences which he draws from the acknowledged relations of living and extinct faunas, as above stated, remained, of course, unaltered. The following extracts from H. F. Blandford's most interesting paper, read before a meeting of the Geological Society, deals with the subject in still greater detail. And it says here, the affinities between the fossils of both animals and plants of the Beaufort group of Africa and those of the Indian Panchets and Cathmies are such as to suggest the former existence of a land connection between the two areas, but the resemblance of the African and Indian fossil faunas does not cease with Permian and Triassic times. The plant beds of the Utica group have furnished 11 forms of plants, 2 of which Mr. Tate has identified with Indian Ramagul plants. The Indian Jurassic fossils have yet to be described, with a few exceptions, but it has been stated that Dr. Stolecka was much struck with the affinities of certain of the Kutch fossils to African forms, and Dr. Stolecka and Mr. Griesbach have shown that the Cretaceous fossils of the Utafuni River in Natal, the majority, 22 out of the 35 described forms, are identical with species from southern India. Now, the plant-bearing series of India and the Karoo and part of the Uitenhage Formation of Africa are all, in all probability, of freshwater origin, both indicating the existence of a large land area around, from the waste of which these deposits are derived. Was this land continuous between the two regions? And is there anything in the present physical geography of the Indian Ocean which would suggest its probable position? So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So this goes on at length to describe some of these geological types of evidences that all of this was at one time connected. And this, of course, is what would later become to be known as Lemuria. Of course, it was known in the secret schools before all of this geological and geographic study was applied to it. Like I said, a lot of this is just to reify the things they've already believed. So this little portion here goes on at quite some length here, talking about much of this. But let's go down, because it says now, to sum up the views advanced in this paper. First, the plant-bearing series of India ranges from early Permian to the late Jurassic times, indicating, except in a few cases and locally, the uninterrupted continuity of land and freshwater conditions. These may have prevailed from much earlier times. Secondly, in the early Permian, as in the post-Pliocene age, a cold climate prevailed down to low latitudes, and I am inclined to believe in both hemispheres simultaneously. With the decrease of cold, the flora and reptilian fauna of Permian times were diffused to Africa, India, and now possibly Australia, or the flora may have existed in Australia somewhat earlier and have been diffused thence. So thirdly, India, South Africa, and Australia were connected by an Indo-Oceanic continent in the Permian epoch, and the two former countries remained connected with, at the utmost, only short interruptions up to the end of the Miocene period. During the latter part of the time, this land was also connected with Molayana. Fourth, in common with some previous writers, I consider that the position of this land was defined by the range of coral reefs and banks that now exist between the Arabian Sea and East Africa. Fifth, up to the end of the Nummulic epoch, no direct connection, except possibly for short periods, existed between India and Western Asia. In the discussion which followed the reading of this paper, Professor Ramsay agreed with the author in the belief in this junction of Africa with India and Australia in geological times. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now, to sum it up, they're pretty certain that there was this massive southern continent, and all these different areas were connected. That's the extent of what is revealed in this portion. But let's get back to it, and we'll see the more interesting facets of information that it does give us here regarding this Lemurian continent. Right now, they're giving you what the more modern terms for these past epochs were. We've all heard of like the Pliocene era and the Jurassic era and things like this. Well, they have different names for this stuff within the occult fraternities. They call these different time periods by different names, various different epochs. And we're going to learn about the Lemurian epoch here very shortly. So Mr. Woodward was pleased to find that the author had added further evidence derived from the fossil flora of the Mesozoic series of India in corroboration with the views of Huxley, Sclater, and others as to the former existence of an old submerged continent called Lemuria, which Darwin's researches on coral reefs had long since foreshadowed. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now we're hearing some familiar names: Huxley, and of course Sclater we mentioned earlier, and Darwin. You see, Darwin's studies, of course, they foreshadowed the existence of this great southern continent. You see how they tie it all together with a nice, neat little bow tie. Let's read on. Of the 5 now existing continents, writes Ernst Haeckel, in his great work, The History of Creation, neither Australia nor America nor Europe can have been the primeval home of man, or the so-called paradise, the cradle of the human race. Most circumstances indicate southern Asia as the locality in question. Besides southern Asia, the only other of the now existing continents which might be viewed in this light is Africa. But there are a number of circumstances, especially chorological facts, which suggest that the primeval home of man was a continent now sunk below the surface of the Indian Ocean, which extended along the south of Asia, as it is at present, and probably in direct connection with it, towards the east, as far as further India, and the Sunda Islands towards the west, as far as Madagascar, and the southern or southeastern shores of Africa. We have already mentioned that many facts in animal and vegetable geography render the former existence of such a South Indian continent very probable. Sclater has given this continent the name of Lemuria, from the semi-apes which were characteristic of it. By assuming this Lemuria to have been man's primeval home, we greatly facilitate the explanation of the geographical distribution of the human species by migration. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. If you haven't heard of Ernst Haeckel, know this guy had connections to the secret schools, of course, as many of the others do, and of course he believed many of these same things and put forward a lot of questionable science. In fact, it's Haeckel's drawings that still exist in textbooks today, even though they've long been proven false. But they still use these as evidence of Darwinian evolution. And Haeckel's drawings are also the ones where you've probably learned or heard that you see when the human being is a fetus in the womb, at one point he develops gill slits, which is absolutely false and asinine. But it was Ernst Haeckel that made those original drawings showing the development of the fetus, and therefore saying that the human being goes through this evolutionary process in the womb through all the different forms, and that the fetus looks the same as the fetus of the lower animals through the developmental stages. It was Ernst Haeckel that put this idea forward, and it's since been proven false, but it's still in textbooks today being taught as truth, even though these ideas have now long been discredited. That's who Ernst Haeckel is. And he's being quoted here as one of the guys that gives the primary evidence that this was the cradle of human civilization. How much trust can you put in that? Whether it's true or not is irrelevant, though. What you need to understand, there's people in this world that very much believe this and act on it and act like it's real, so things they do will have an effect. Let's read on, though. So it says here, in a subsequent work, The Pedigree of Man, Haeckel asserts the existence of Lemuria at some early epoch of the Earth's history as an acknowledged fact. The following quotation from Dr. Hartlob's writings may bring to a close this portion of the evidence in favor of the existence of the lost Lemuria. And we'll quote here from Dr. Hartlob's writings, quote, 35 years ago, Isidore Geoffrey St. Hilaire remarked that if one had to classify the island of Madagascar exclusively on zoological considerations and without reference to its geographical situation, it could be shown to be neither Asiatic nor African, but quite different from either, and almost a fourth continent. And this fourth continent could be further proved to be, as regards its fauna, much more different from Africa, which lies so near to it, than from India, which is so far away. With these words, the correctness and pregnancy of which later investigations tend to bring into their full light, the French naturalist first stated the interesting problem for the solution of which a hypothesis based on scientific knowledge had recently been propounded. For this fourth continent of Isidore Geoffrey is Sclater's Lemuria, that sunken land which, containing parts of Africa, must have extended far eastwards over southern India and Ceylon, and the highest points of which we recognize in the volcanic peaks of Bourbon and Mauritius, and in the central range of Madagascar itself, the last resorts of the almost extinct Lemurine race, which formerly peopled it. End quote. All right, now we're going to get into evidence obtained from archaic records. Now, these would probably be some of the things contained in the secret doctrine, some of the records maintained by the secret schools. As we'll see here, and we'll connect some dots, and we'll describe some things. Buckle up, kids. So the evidence obtained from archaic records, the further evidence we have with regard to Lemuria and its inhabitants, has been obtained from the same source and in the same manner as that which resulted in the writing of the story of Atlantis. In this case, also, the author has been privileged to obtain copies of two maps, one representing Lemuria and the adjoining lands during the period of that continent's greatest expansion, the other exhibiting its outlines after its dismemberment by great catastrophes, but long before its final destruction. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now we have, as always in the secret schools, this continuing cycle of catastrophic events, catastrophes, which bring these epochs to a sudden and tragic end. And a remnant that remains goes into the next epoch and evolves into the next level of humanity. We'll get there. Let's read on. It was never professed that the maps of Atlantis were correct to a single degree of latitude or longitude, but, with the far greater difficulty of obtaining the information in the present case, it must be stated that still less must these maps of Lemuria be taken as absolutely accurate. In the former case, there was a globe, a good bas-relief in terracotta, and a well-preserved map on parchment, or skin of some sort to copy from. In the present case, there was only a broken terracotta model and a badly preserved and crumpled map, so that the difficulty of carrying back the remembrance of all the details and consequently of reproducing exact copies has been far greater. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now we have, well, these maps that were given, they might not be so accurate. Is there validity to this or not? I don't know. Can't say that I know for sure. But they claim to actually have maps now of what this southern continent looked like. And of course they have maps of what Atlantis allegedly looked like as well during these time periods. And nobody really knows for sure if these were the shapes of the landforms or not. But let's go ahead and let's read on. We were told that it was by mighty adepts in the days of Atlantis that the Atlantean maps were produced, but we are not aware whether the Lemurian maps were fashioned by some of the divine instructors in the days when Lemuria still existed, or in still later days of the Atlantean epoch. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So we have maps that were cataloged and maintained in secrecy in the secret schools, the occult fraternities, for a long time. And they're not quite sure where they came from, if they came from the Atlanteans, or if they were older still and they came from the various adepts or divine instructors from the times of the Lemurians. And we'll read on and we'll get there. So it says, but while guarding against overconfidence in the absolute accuracy of the maps in question, the transcriber of the archaic originals believes that they may, in all important particulars, be taken as approximately correct. So next we have the probable duration of the continent of Lemuria. A period, speaking roughly, of between 4 and 5 million years probably represents the life of the continent of Atlantis, for it is about that time since the Ramahals, the first sub-race of the fourth root race who inhabited Atlantis, arose on a portion of the Lemurian continent, which at that time still existed. Remembering that in the evolutionary process, the figure 4 invariably represents not only the nadir of the cycle, but the period of shortest duration, whether in the case of the Manvantara or of a race, it may be assumed that the number of millions of years assignable as the life limit of the continent of Lemuria must be very much greater than that representing the life of Atlantis, the continent of the fourth root race. But in the case of Lemuria, no dates can be stated with even approximate accuracy. Geological epochs, so far as they are known to modern science, will be a better medium for contemporary reference, and they alone will be dealt with. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now we're getting into a little bit of the meat and potatoes of this information. So we see the Ramahals. They were the first sub-race of the fourth root race, who were the Atlanteans, and they came from Lemuria. They were the remnant of Lemuria that came to Atlantis and established the Atlantean culture and evolved into the Atlantean culture, as we'll see here, according to the secret doctrine. And of course, they're saying they can't possibly know for certain the length of the existence of this civilization, of this Lemurian continent, but they're estimating around 4 to 5 million years is how long it lasted. And they reserve the right to be wrong about that, of course. But for reference point, they say the fourth root race here, it would be a shorter time period, because they're saying this is part of how the cycles change. It's almost like the acknowledgement of something called the fourth turning, even in the secret schools, going back to antiquity here. But let's continue on. So now it's saying here, it's hard to really ascertain the time period, how long the epoch was, or when exactly it occurred, with the use of the records given by the secret schools. So they'll look at the modernly accepted scientific geological paradigm for the use of the maps. So now it describes the maps. But not even geological epochs, it will be observed, are assigned to the maps. If, however, an inference may be drawn from all the evidence before us, it would seem probable that the older of the two Lemurian maps represented the Earth's configuration from the Permian through the Triassic and into the Jurassic epoch, while the second map probably represents the Earth's configuration through the Cretaceous and into the Eocene period. From the older of the two maps, it may be seen that the equatorial continent of Lemuria, at the time of its greatest expansion nearly girdled the globe, extending as it did from the site of the present Cape Verde Islands a few miles from the coast of Sierra Leone in a southeasterly direction toward or through Africa, Australia, the Society Islands, and all the intervening seas to a point but a few miles distance from a great island continent about the size of the present South America, which spread over the remainder of the Pacific Ocean and included Cape Horn and parts of Patagonia. A remarkable feature in the second map of Lemuria is the great length and at parts the extreme narrowness of the straits which separated the two great blocks of land into which the continent had by this time been split. And it will be observed that the straits at present existing between the islands of Bali and Lombok coincide with a portion of the straits which then divided these two continents. It will also be seen that these straits continued in northerly direction by the west, not by the east coast of Borneo, as conjectured by Ernst Haeckel. With reference to the distribution of fauna and flora and the existence of so many types common to India and Africa alike, pointed out by Mr. Blandford, it will be observed that between parts of India and great tracts of Africa there was direct land communication during the first map period, and that similar communication was partially maintained in the second map period also, while a comparison of the maps of Atlantis with those of Lemuria will demonstrate that continuous land communication existed, now at one epoch and now at another, between so many different parts of the Earth's surface, at present separated by sea, that the existing distribution of fauna and flora in the two Americas, in Europe and in eastern lands, which has been such a puzzle to naturalists, may with perfect ease be accounted for. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now the claim is they have these millions and millions of years old maps that were made and maintained by human beings from that time forward. This is the claim. Now, these maps, they may not be entirely accurate, according to what they say here, but they're probably pretty close. That's what they're claiming. This is what they're claiming, so this is actually placing mankind back millions of years, keeping records for millions of years. That's what the implication is here. That's what the inference is here. If we have maps that were made by people from the Lemurian epoch, millions of years ago, and they've maintained these maps and brought them forward, that could be a huge deal. Think about that. Because we really don't know much about our history, do we? We have about 6,000 years worth of records. This is what's claimed and what's stated. Mankind has only been writing things down for maybe 6,000 to 9,000 years. Tops. We don't have records before that time. We may have oral traditions, and that's about it. But according to the secret schools, they had people making maps millions of years ago. People. Distant ancestors of modern man that were much different than we are now, and we'll get there. Let's read on. The island indicated in the earlier Lemurian map as existing to the northwest of the extreme promontory of the continent and due west of the present coast of Spain was probably a center from which proceeded, during long ages, the distribution of fauna and flora above referred to. For, and this is a most interesting fact, it will be seen that this island must have been the nucleus from first to last of the subsequent great continent of Atlantis. It existed, as we see, in the earliest Lemurian times. It was joined in the second map period to land which had previously formed part of the great Lemurian continent, and indeed so many accretions of territory had it by this time received that it might more appropriately be called a continent than an island. It was the great mountainous region of Atlantis at its prime, when Atlantis embraced great tracts of land which have now become North and South America. It remained the mountainous region of Atlantis in its decadence, and of Ruta in the Ruta and Daitya epoch, and it practically constituted the islands of Poseidonus. Going to pause for a moment here. We spoke about this in the other episodes on the secret history you were never taught. Poseidonus, the last remnant of the continent of Atlantis, the final submergence of which took place in the year 9564 BC. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. Now, Poseidonus, the very last portion of Atlantis. According to the records kept by the secret schools, it finally submerged and sunk catastrophically in this cataclysmic event in the year 9564 BC. They have an exact year. What does that tell you? Do these people really have records going back that far? Do they really know something we don't? Or is this fanciful fiction? Either way, like I said, regardless of what you believe about it, there's people in positions of power in this world that very much believe in these things, and the things they do to act upon their beliefs will affect all of us. 9564 BC, that is when Atlantis sank beneath the waves, once and for all, and according to the records of the secret schools, it sunk catastrophically, and this caused massive earth changes and problems. And they even claim at one point the Atlantic Ocean became so shallow and so muddy that it became impassable, and it cut off communication between the American continents and the European and Asian continents. Made it impossible to cross the Atlantic Ocean at that point. For many thousands of years. For several thousands of years after that. That is one of the explanations they give in the secret schools here. But let's get back to it, just to give you context there. A comparison of the two maps here given, along with the 4 maps of Atlantis, will also show that Australia and New Zealand, Madagascar, parts of Somaliland, the south of Africa, and the extreme southern portion of Patagonia are lands which have probably existed through all the intervening catastrophes since the early days of the Lemurian period. The same may be said of the southern parts of India and Ceylon, with the exception, in the case of Ceylon, of a temporary submergence in the Ruta and Daitya epoch. It is true, there are also remains still existing of the even earlier Hyperborean continent, and they, of course, are the oldest known lands on the face of the earth. These are Greenland, Iceland, Spitsbergen, the most northerly parts of Norway and Sweden, and the extreme North Cape of Siberia. Japan is shown by the maps to have been above water, whether as an island or as part of a continent, since the date of the second Lemurian map. Spain, too, has doubtless existed since that time. Spain is, therefore, with the exception of the most northerly parts of Norway and Sweden, probably the oldest land in Europe. The indeterminate character of the statements just made is rendered necessary by our knowledge that there did occur subsidences and upheavals of different portions of the Earth's surface during the ages which lay between the periods represented by the maps. For example, soon after the date of the second Lemurian map, we are informed that the whole Malay Peninsula was submerged and remained so for a long time, but a subsequent upheaval of that region must have taken place before the date of the first Atlantean map, for what is now the Malay Peninsula is there exhibited as part of a great continent. Similarly, there have been repeated minor subsidences and upheavals nearer home in more recent times, and Haeckel is perfectly correct in saying that England, he might with greater accuracy have said the islands of Great Britain and Ireland, which were then joined together, has repeatedly been connected with the European continent and been repeatedly separated from it. In order to bring the subject more dearly before the mind, a tabular statement is here annexed, which supplies a condensed history of the animal and plant life on our globe, bracketed, according to Haeckel, with the contemporary rock strata. Two other columns give the contemporary races of man and such of the great cataclysms as are known to occult students. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now they're combining the old occult sciences, the old hidden knowledge, the secret doctrine, with what they consider more modern scientific terms. And we see here Haeckel is putting together these brackets showing the evolution of fauna and flora and also races of man through these various eras of time. Let's go ahead and we'll read on because we're going to get to some of the most interesting parts here coming up now. Reptiles and pine forests. From this statement, it will be seen that the Lemurian man lived in the age of reptiles and pine forests. Gonna pause for a moment here. Lemurian man. So this is an ancient race of human beings. Let's read on, and it says that he lived in the age of reptiles and pine forests. The amphibious monsters and the gigantic tree ferns of the Permian age still flourished in the warm, damp climates. Plesiosauri and ichthyosauri swarmed in the tepid marshes of the Mesolithic epoch, but with the drying up of many of the inland seas, the Dinosauria, the monstrous land reptiles, gradually became the dominant type, while the pterodactyls, the saurians, which developed bat-like wings, not only crawled on the earth, but flew through the air. The smallest of these latter were about the size of a sparrow, the largest, however, with a breadth of wing of more than 16 feet, exceeding the largest of our living birds of today, while most of the Dinosauria, the dragons, were terrible beasts of prey, colossal reptiles which attained a length from 40 to 50 feet. Subsequent excavations have laid bare skeletons of an even larger size. Professor Ray Lancaster, at a meeting of the Royal Institution on the 7th of January 1904, is reported to have referred to a brontosaurus skeleton of 75 feet long, which had been discovered in the oolite deposit in the southern part of the United States of America. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now, dinosaurs have made their emergence here. And of course, in the secret doctrine, they may have been referred to as dragons prior to the advent of dinosaurs in the mid to late 1800s. Around the time of the formation of the Theosophical Society, around the time that many of these records were brought together and formulated. And it's amazing how all of these ideas reify one another. So now we have this notion of dinosaurs in the secret doctrine. Let's read on. It gets interesting. As it is written in the stanzas of the archaic book of Zion, quote, animals with bones, dragons of the deep, and flying sarpas were added to the creeping things. They that creep on the ground got wings. They of the long necks in the water became the progenitors of the fowls of the air, end quote. I'm going to pause for a second here, folks. Now, remember, this book was written in 1904. And now we see, in more modern times, they're equating the evolution of dinosaurs into birds. They pre-echoed that back then, and they pre-echoed that idea way back in the secret doctrine. The dinosaurs became birds. Amazing how all these things interrelate, isn't it? Now, is this all true and scientifically validated, or is this just them giving us our modern science and telling us this in our modern science to back up their beliefs, to reify their beliefs? So they invent evidence to show this. I don't know. I don't know which way this works. Is it true or not? Doesn't matter. They believe it's true. Did dinosaurs really exist? Well, I think perhaps there were dragons. We see description of that throughout all different times and cultures, but they're describing them as different types of dinosaurs here, as we see. And of course, they're equating different ideas to it. But let's read on. So it says, modern science records her endorsement. The class of birds, as already remarkably remarked, is so closely allied to reptiles in internal structure and by embryonal development that they undoubtedly originated out of a branch of this class. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. Notice they mention embryonal development between lizards or reptiles and birds, and all of these ideas directly came from Haeckel in the modern era, in these times. Haeckel reifying these ideas given in the secret doctrine. So now you know a little something more. Many of these scientific personages of historic importance oftentimes put forward these ideas which were only put there to reify the secret doctrine. And you have to wonder how much of our science and how much of our history is convoluted just to keep touting the idea, reifying the idea of this secret doctrine, trying to make it true, whether it's true or not. They do everything in their power to try to reinforce the idea and make it true in some sense. But let's continue on here. The derivation of birds from reptiles first took place in the Mesolithic epoch, and this, moreover, probably during the Trias. In the vegetable kingdom, this epoch also saw the pine and the palm tree gradually displace the giant tree ferns. In the later days of the Mesolithic epoch, mammals for the first time came into existence, but the fossil remains of the mammoth and mastodon, which were their earliest representatives, are chiefly found in the subsequent strata of the Eocene and Miocene times. And next, we get to the important portion here. The human kingdom. Before making any reference to what must, even at this early date, be called the human kingdom, it must be stated that none of those who at the present day can lay claim to even a moderate amount of mental or spiritual culture can have lived in these ages. It was only with the advent of the last three sub-races of this third root race that the least progressed of the first group of the lunar Pitris began to return to incarnation, while the most advanced among them did not take birth till the early sub-races of the Atlantean period. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now we're getting back to the cosmology of the secret schools. You see, we weren't truly human yet until this third root race that were incarnated by the lunar Pitris in this period, and many not until the early sub-races of the Atlantean period. So the late Lemurian period and early Atlantean period is when what they consider the forebears of modern man came into being, mankind as a physical entity here. A physical entity did not begin until such time. And of course, they push these back millions of years, these periods. But let's go ahead and we'll read on. Just wanted to put that there. You have to look into, I think the best place to look would be the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception to understand these different eras or epochs and these different cycles of evolution that are claimed by these old teachings. And we go through these different periods. The moon period, the earth period, this kind of thing. And how it correlates with these different root races and sub-races of man at these early times. But let's get right back to it here. Indeed, Lemurian man, during at least the first half of the race, must be regarded rather as an animal destined to reach humanity than as human according to our understanding of the term. For though the second and third groups of Pitris, who constituted the inhabitants of Lemuria during its first 4 sub-races, had achieved sufficient self-consciousness in the lunar Manvantara to differentiate them from the animal kingdom, they had not yet received the divine spark, which should endow them with mind and individuality, in other words, making them truly human. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now this is some of the startling information about mankind's past, at least according to the secret schools, and you'll begin to connect some dots as we read through this next portion before we wrap it up here tonight. The size and consistency of man's body. The evolution of this Lemurian race therefore constitutes one of the most obscure as well as one of the most interesting chapters of man's development, for during this period not only did he reach true humanity, but his body underwent the greatest physical changes, while the processes of reproduction were twice altered. In explanation of the surprising statements which will have to be made in regard to the size and consistency of man's body at this early period, it must be remembered that while the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms pursued the normal course, on this, the 4th globe, during the 4th round of this Manvantara, it was ordained that humanity should run over in rapid succession the various stages through which its evolution had passed during the previous rounds of the present Manvantara. Thus, the bodies of the first root race, which these almost mindless beings were destined to gain experience, would have appeared to us as gigantic phantoms, if indeed we could have seen them at all, for their bodies were formed of astral matter. The astral forms of the first root race were then gradually enveloped in a more physical casing. But though the second root race may be called physical, their bodies being composed of ether, they would have been equally invisible to eyesight, as it is at present exists. It was, we are told, in order that the Manu and the beings who aided him might take means for improving the physical type of humanity, that this epitome of the process of evolution was ordained. The highest development which the type had so far reached was the huge ape-like creature which had existed on the 3 physical planets, Mars, the Earth, and Mercury, in the 3rd round. I'm gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Are you picking up some of this? Do you wonder where these notions of ancient aliens and everything comes from? Are you hearing the things implied here? Now, remember, the claim is they didn't exist in a truly yet physical type form as we would acknowledge it today. They existed only in these preeminent etheric stages at this point, and astral prior to that. But let's read on. Gets even more interesting here. And like I said, in order to understand some of the context here, it might be useful to go back and look at the Rosicrucian cosmoconception as it explains these various forms of the evolutionary processes accepted by the secret doctrine. Going back, it's a convoluted jumble to people who haven't really read deeply into this. But let's read on. On the arrival of the human life wave on the Earth, in this, the 4th round, a certain number, naturally, of these ape-like creatures were found in occupation, the residuum left on the planet during its period of obscuration. These, of course, joined the incoming human stream as soon as the race became fully physical. Their bodies may not then have been absolutely discarded. They may have been utilized for purposes of reincarnation for the most backward entities, but it was an improvement on this type which was required, and this was most easily achieved by the Manu, through which through working out on the astral plane, in the first instance, the archetype originally formed in the mind of the Logos. From the etheric second race, then, was evolved the third, the Lemurian. Their bodies had become material, being composed of the gases, liquids, and solids, which constitute the three lowest subdivisions of the physical plane. But the gases and liquids still predominated, for as yet their vertebrate structure had not solidified into bones such as ours, and they could not, therefore, stand erect. Their bones, in fact, were pliable, as the bones of young infants now are. It was not until the middle of the Lemurian period that man developed a solid, bony structure. To explain the possibility of the process by which the etheric form evolved into a more physical form, and the soft-boned physical form ultimately developed into a structure such as man possesses today, it is only necessary to refer to the permanent physical atom, containing as it does the essence of all the forms through which man has passed on the physical plane. It contained, consequently, the potentiality of a hard-boned physical structure such as had been attained during the course of the third round, as well as the potentiality of an etheric form and all the phases which lie between. For it must be remembered that the physical plane consists of 4 grades of ether, as well as the gases, liquids, and solids, which so many are apt to regard as alone constituting the physical. I'm going to pause for a moment there. 4 etheric phases of matter. You see, this is an important concept that I think has been lost on modern science. That's known within these secret schools, and I think is known in some of the more obscure, off-the-books physics that's acknowledged in certain special access programs in this world, but not in the common mindset. So remember that. But let's continue on. So it says, thus, every stage of the development was a natural process, for it was a process which had been accomplished in ages long past, and all that was needed was for the Manu and the beings who aided him to gather round the permanent atom, the appropriate kind of matter. And now, folks, before we wrap it up, we're going to give you a description of the Lemurian man. But first, the organs of vision. And we'll see this is important, and this ties things together for us. The organs of vision of these creatures before they developed bones were of a rudimentary nature. At least such was the condition of the 2 eyes in front, with which they sought for the food upon the ground. But there was a third eye at the back of the head, the atrophied remnant of which is now known as the pineal gland. This, as we know, is now a center solely of astral vision, but at that epoch of which we are speaking, it was the chief center not only of astral but of physical sight. Referring to reptiles which had become extinct, Professor Ray Lancaster, in a recent lecture at the Royal Institution, is reported to have drawn special attention to the size of the parietal foramen in the skull, which showed that in the ichthyosaurs, the parietal or pineal eye on the top of the head must have been very large. In this respect, he went on to say, mankind were inferior to these big sea lizards, for we had lost the third eye, which might be studied in the common lizard, or better, in the great blue lizard of the south of France. Gonna pause for a moment there, folks. The third eye. Let's continue, and we'll wrap it up here in just a few more minutes, because I want to get to these important bits of information. Somewhat before the middle of the Lemurian period, probably during the evolution of the third subrace, the gigantic gelatinous body began slowly to solidify, and the soft-boned limbs developed into a bony structure. These primitive creatures were now able to stand upright, and the 2 eyes in the face gradually became the chief organs of physical sight, though the third eye still remained, to some extent, an organ of physical sight also, and this it did till the very end of the Lemurian epoch. It, of course, remained an actual organ, as still is a potential focus of psychic vision. The psychic vision continued to be an attribute of the race not only throughout the whole Lemurian period, but well into the days of Atlantis. A curious fact to note, when the race first attained the power of standing and moving in an upright position, they could walk backwards with almost as great ease as forwards. This may be accounted for not only by the capacity for vision possessed by the third eye, but doubtless also by the curious projection at the heels, which will presently be referred to. I'm going to pause again here before we get into this, the description of Lemurian man. A lot of these things will begin to connect some dots for you. So we have this notion of the third eye, or the eye in the back of the head. An interesting thought in and of itself. And of course, they're quoting from this Ray Lancaster talking about how these dinosaurs had such an appendage. And of course, all of this has since disappeared from the textbooks, hasn't it? I've never heard dinosaurs having a third eye in the back of their head. Have you? But apparently, this was a thing in 1904. That's another topic for another day that we might have to take a run at sometime, is how dinosaurs, their description, and all of the things associated with them have changed through the course of the decades here. Even from the time I was a child, the things we were taught about dinosaurs back then compared to what they're saying about them now have totally changed. And it's amazing, and much of the old literature has disappeared entirely. So there's obfuscation going on there, whether it's to the fact that maybe these creatures didn't exist at all and they're just a contrivance or fanciful fiction, or maybe there was a real creature called a dragon, or maybe there's something else entirely different about them that we're not being told. I don't know. I don't have the answers. But it's interesting to think about, isn't it? And it's interesting to note that they're not being straight with us, apparently, about this. Now remember, a lot of this comes from the secret doctrine and the secret schools themselves. But let's get back to this description of Lemurian man. The following is a description of a man who belonged to one of the later sub-races, probably the fifth. His stature was gigantic, somewhere between 12 and 15 feet. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now acknowledged by the secret schools, giants most certainly did exist. Giant human beings. This, I think, is something that is massively important. And we see the evidence of this being the case, and we see how authority figures have taken great pains to hide the evidence of giants. And maybe that has to do with some of the obfuscation about dinosaurs as well. And we'll see there's a connection. Let's continue reading here. His skin was very dark, being of a yellowish-brown color. He had a long lower jaw, a strangely flattened face, eyes small but piercing and set curiously far apart, so that he could see sideways as well as in front, while the eye at the back of the head, on which part of the head had no hair, of course, grew, enabled him to see in that direction also. I'm going to pause for a moment, folks. So he had a third eye in the back of his head, where no hair grew on that portion of the head where the eye was, being described as having a very flat-looking face with a jutting chin. And I would say, look at the Moai statues on Easter Island to get a more accurate representation of what Lemurian man looked like. That's what the secret schools claim these statues are of. They're not just stylized types of statues. This is what ancient human beings, according to the secret schools, allegedly really looked like. They were giants 12 to 15 feet tall, looking very much like that. Let's continue reading and you'll see what I'm talking about. So, he had a long lower jaw, a strangely flattened face, eyes small but piercing and set curiously far apart, so that he could see sideways as well as in front, Well, the eye at the back of the head, on which part of the head no hair, of course, grew, enabled him to see in that direction also. He had no forehead, but there seemed to be a roll of flesh where it should have been. The head sloped backwards and upwards in a rather curious way. The arms and legs, especially the former, were longer in proportion than ours, and could not be perfectly straightened either at the elbows or knees. The hands and feet were enormous, and the heels projected backwards in an ungainly way. The figure was draped in a loose robe of skin, something like rhinoceros hide, but more scaly, probably the skin of some animal, of which we now know only through its fossil remains. Round his head, on which the hair was quite short, was twisted another piece of skin to which were attached tassels of bright red, blue, and other colors. In his left hand he held a sharpened staff, which was doubtless used for defense or attack. It was about the height of his own body, vis-a-vis 12 to 15 feet. In his right hand was twisted the end of a long rope made of some sort of creeping plant, by which he led a huge and hideous reptile somewhat resembling the plesiosaurus. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. That's right. Man had tamed dinosaurs in the Lemurian epoch, according to the secret schools. The Lemurians actually domesticated these creatures and trained them to employ their strength in hunting other animals. The appearance of the man gave an unpleasant sensation, but he was not entirely uncivilized, being an average commonplace specimen of his day. Many were even less human in appearance than the individual here described, but the seventh subrace developed a superior type, though very unlike any living men of the present time. While retaining the projecting lower jaw, the thick, heavy lips, the flattened face, and the uncanny-looking eyes, they had by this time developed something which might be called a forehead, while the curious projection of the heel had been considerably reduced. In one branch of this seventh subrace, the head might be described as almost egg-shaped, the small end of the egg being uppermost, with the eyes wide apart and very near the top. The stature had perceptibly decreased, and the appearance of the hands, feet, and limbs generally had become more like those of the Negroes of today. These people developed an important and long-lasting civilization, and for thousands of years dominated most of the other tribes who dwelt on the vast Lemurian continent, and even at the end, when racial decay seemed to be overtaking them, they secured another long lease of life and power by intermarriage with the Remohals, the first subrace of the Atlanteans. The progeny, while retaining many third-race characteristics, of course, really belonged to the fourth race, and thus naturally acquired fresh power of development. Their general appearance now became not unlike that of some American Indians, except that their skin had a curious bluish tinge, not now to be seen. But surprising as were the changes in the size, consistency, and appearance of man's body during this period, the alterations in the process of reproduction are still more astounding. A reference to the systems which now obtain among the lower kingdoms of nature may help us in the consideration of the subject. And I think we're going to end it right there for tonight, folks. And maybe we'll come back to that. So you see, Lemurian men, this epoch of Lemuria, millions and millions of years ago, this race of men, according to the secret schools, lived. They domesticated dinosaurs. They were giants, 12 to 15 feet tall. They had eyes in the back of their head. These were also in this crossover between this final phase of the Lemurians and the first phase of the Atlanteans. This crossover period, this is where they were said to hop around like kangaroos, according to the Rosicrucian accounts. You see, they couldn't unbend their legs, as was being said here. So they have a lot of records in the secret schools of these very specific types of details about this. Now, is it all fanciful fiction, or is there something to it? I don't know. I don't have the answer. I find it extremely interesting and curious, and when you look and you find artifacts like the Moai on Easter Island that directly relate to this description given here by the secret schools of these Lemurian giants, things begin to connect. Dots begin to connect. And perhaps we have a better understanding of our past. Or maybe not. Nobody can really say for sure how old mankind truly is. But this is maintained within their secret doctrine. And this is stuff you've probably never heard before. Or if you have, you've heard a twisted and convoluted version of it. At some point, I think we've all heard that perhaps there existed in the past giants, and we hear all these stories of giants. And we have, of course, the evidence of giants that has largely been covered up by authority figures in this world. There's something to it. Let's put it that way. I most definitely think there's something to the notion that at one time in our ancient past, giants existed. Now, were these just the forerunners of human beings, or was there some type of intermingling between the fallen angels and mankind that developed these giant races? And we'll get to more of that as we continue, because I'm going to make this into a part 2. Maybe we'll go a little deeper even. I don't know how far we'll get through it, but I think we'll pick it up next time where we left off here, talking about how the processes of reproduction had changed at this time as well in mankind. And we'll see some of the descriptions that are given through their secret doctrine about the origins of mankind, where we came from, and how we've evolved since then, according to the secret schools here, according to their secret doctrine, which is held in high esteem by those at the topmost levels of the power structure of this world, those dark occultists who run things. Maybe they do know something a little deeper about our ancient past than we do, and they've kept it hidden. I most certainly do think there's a plethora of evidence to suggest that giants one time existed. Now, the nature of these giants, it's hard to say for sure what their true origins were, but we have this secret doctrine that talks about them. We have the biblical Genesis 6 story that talks about them. The book of Enoch talks about them. We have the cultures of Greece, the Greeks, the Romans talk about giants, the Titans. We have all these notions of things. We have physical evidence here in the Americas of red-haired giants that existed. We've had many of these types of burial mounds that have had giant skeletons in them, 12 to 15 feet tall. Some of them smaller than that, some of them bigger. We've had reports of this stuff. So I think there's something to the notion. And maybe these are some of the details that we've missed, that are tucked away neatly in this secret doctrine. So these are ideas that are worthy of investigation, in my view. And I think it's important that we go through this. And we have these accounts now. We have them available to us thanks to the wonders of the internet. So it doesn't hurt to give it consideration and to think about it. At the very least, it's interesting to think about whether it's true or not, and whether it's fanciful fiction or whether there is some semblance or merits of truth to it. Regardless of that, it's most certainly interesting, and it's good to go at these things from these different perspectives and understand the vantage point and the perspective of those people in positions of power in this world, who view the world through this lens with this knowledge that we don't have, the public doesn't have. Maybe the human race is far older than we know. Maybe some portions of this are true. Maybe some of these monoliths of antiquity were built by these giants, by these Lemurian races, by these primitive cultures of men way back in antiquity. And who knows what these former races of humanity have lived through and how they have advanced and what they've seen. And are we repeating a cycle? Are we just another race of men in a long cycle of these different races? Like I said, at the very least, it's all very interesting to think about, and it's worthy of investigation. And we will continue this. But that's all I have for tonight, folks. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good night now.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Show.